The Star Wars prequels release caused a few retcons to be needed within the expanded universe, related to things like the nature of the clone army, which I've covered in some prior videos. But the prequels also pulled in some parts of the expanded universe, from species to ships to planets and even some characters. And today we're going to talk about some of the bigger things you may recognize from the movies, but which were originally from other, earlier Star Wars media. The focus here is going to be on things created for and introduced in the expanded universe, rather than examples like General Grievous, Venators, or other elements which were technically released first in other tie-in media before their prequel appearance, but which were still created for the movies and just happened to release in that other media first. Prequel planets may be the most famous area where content from the expanded universe influenced the movies. Early drafts of Star Wars had included the idea of a city planet as the Imperial capital, once George moved on from the idea of Alderaan being the Imperial capital. But while he eventually came up with Had Abaddon as a potential name for the planet, since technology was too limited to include that kind of planet in the movies, the concept went unused. Despite being unused, the idea of a city planet as the Imperial capital stuck, though it tended to just be referenced as Imperial Center, not getting a proper name for the planet. This changed when Timothy Zahn wrote the Thrawn trilogy, where he gave the capital of the Empire, which was by then the capital of the New Republic, the name Coruscant. When George was making the prequels, technology had finally moved along enough to let him show the massive Ecumenopolis planet, and he was persuaded to just keep the name which had been used in supplemental materials for almost a decade by the time of the Phantom Menace's release, all of which means the most iconic planet name in Star Wars, other than maybe Tatooine, came from the expanded universe. Zahn's contributions will continue to feature pretty prominently throughout this video, but he's also responsible for two of the other planets I want to talk about. The first is Rishi, a somewhat backwater world introduced in the second book of the Thrawn trilogy, Dark Force Rising. Rishi itself doesn't appear in the movies, but it does appear later directly in the Clone Wars cartoon, and you may recognize the name from Dexter's description of where Kamino is, saying Obi-Wan's lost planet was 12 parsecs outside the Rishi Maze. The Rishi Maze has since been identified as a companion galaxy, but the name is likely derived from the planet in Dark Force Rising, which later lore has established as an endpoint for travel to the Rishi Maze. The third and final planet we'll be talking about is slightly more of a tenuous connection, and that is Munilinst. Munilinst features heavily in the tie-in media surrounding Revenge of the Sith, with its indigenous population, the Muns, playing a significant role within the CIS in the movies as well. The planet doesn't show up or get named in Revenge of the Sith itself, and the species name was also only revealed in other tie-in articles rather than in the movie, but the planet originated once again from Timothy Zahn, this time in the Hand of Thrawn duology, where we're introduced to the planet and a banker from it, which matches what we learn about the Muns and the banking clan in Episode 3. Though it is worth noting that Zahn also didn't seem to intend his character from Munilinst to be a non-human species. Some people prefer to retcon it so that character is just a Mun since he's described as tall, but you could also read it as the Imperials who still control that planet even 2 decades after Endor, putting a human in charge of the banks on Munilinst. So this isn't a clear example where something from the expanded universe got brought directly into the movies, but it is an example where a lot of development went on around the same kind of concept, and at the very least development of movie tie-in information was done considering that information from the expanded universe. The Muns aren't the only species which get a tenuous expanded universe expansion of their own. Rodians have of course been around since A New Hope was just called Star Wars, but the name Rodian was, as far as I can tell, actually an expanded universe creation, coming from the West End Games role-playing game supplements, the Galaxy Guides. This name, which again doesn't show up in the movies directly, was used in production notes by George referring to the species, where he also noted that people should like this video and subscribe for more. And what a nice thing that is for him to say. A couple expanded universe species did get fully introduced in the movies, however. One of these species was the Thelans. The first Thelan was Shug Ninx in the Dark Empire comics, but Thelans were later used again in the Phantom Menace and Revenge of the Sith before also featuring pretty heavily in the Clone Wars, and even more recently in The Acolyte, where Jeki is actually half Thelan, half Swiss cheese. Most Thelans we see in any media actually also tend to be half rather than full Thelan. Another member of this species was also put into Return of the Jedi in the special editions. The other big expanded universe species which was reintroduced in the prequels were the Feline. The most famous example of this species is Lord Shizor from Shadows of the Empire, and he was included in the prequels thanks to having a micro machine toy which was used to fill in some of the stands in the Boonty Eve pod race. Not the most prestigious inclusion, but I think it still counts. While not quite as heavily represented as Timothy Zahn's work in the prequels, which we still have at least one more example of coming up, the Republic Comics released 2 issues in 2000, which introduced 2 pretty famous characters that would be used in the movies. First is Aayla Secura, who shows up in Attack of the Clones and even gets her own death scene in Revenge of the Sith's Order 66 montage. She first shows up in issue 19 of the Republic Comics, and George liked her design, so he wanted to add her to the movies. Initially, she wasn't a Twi'lek and was instead some kind of weird fish, so if that hadn't changed, I don't know that we would have had George, noted Twi'lek Gooner, feel so strongly about including her. The other character source from here, though, is Quinlan Vos, and he doesn't make quite as big of a splash, instead only getting a name drop. He was introduced a couple issues before Aayla was, and he was mentioned in episode 3. This name drop was expanded into a much bigger appearance for him in the Clone Wars cartoon, and a background character in the Phantom Menace has actually been retconned into being Quinlan as well. Much more recently, he's referenced as having been part of the Path when Obi-Wan reads the writing on the wall in the Kenobi series. Speaking of the writing on the wall and smooth transitions, Star Wars alphabet characters called Aurebesh have a significant influence from the expanded universe too. While most of the characters we recognize as Aurebesh may have come from the original trilogy with a few different ones in the mix, at that point none of them actually meant anything yet. It wasn't until the West End Games Miniatures companion book that Aurebesh characters were assigned consistent letters to be matched with, although these designs were still somewhat different from what Joe Johnston had made for the original trilogy in at least some cases. Further work was done in the prequels to recreate what Johnston had done, expanding on some of the original characters and turning them into a readable alphabet, which were used for readable signs in the prequel trilogy. But I think West End Games and the expanded universe should get a lot of credit for getting this process started. 2 final, pretty iconic pieces of technology from the prequel trilogy also originally appeared in the expanded universe. When Darth Maul turned on that second lightsaber blade, it was a big moment in theaters, but Exar Kun enjoyers had already seen a double-bladed lightsaber in action in the Tales of the Jedi comics in 1994. I don't know whether this was actually influenced by Exar Kun's, since a saber staff seems kind of like a logical extension of lightsaber technology, but if there's one thing Lucas was directly exposed to from the expanded universe, it would be comic art, so it's not hard to believe that this is where it would have come from. Timothy Zahn, for example, even believes that the interception of Force lightning on a lightsaber was inspired by the comic adaptation of the Thrawn trilogy showing that being done, although again, this is hard to confirm as inspiration rather than just convergent ideas. But finally, I've saved the best for last. Zahn and the Thrawn trilogy are the origins of possibly the most iconic of prequel ships, and I of course mean the Action 6 Freighter. This ship type was introduced as the class for the Wild Card, the flagship of Talon Card smuggling organization, and probably one of the most famous ships in the expanded universe. Zahn himself is of course not responsible for the depictions of the ship, which would come later, but it was referenced for one of the ships sitting on the landing pad on Theed in Attack of the Clones, and I'm pretty sure I remember them popping up in the Book of Boba Fett coming into Tatooine as well, but my memory might be wrong there. I just think I remember talking about that on our podcast when the trailers were coming out. Either way, that's going to do it for our look at the expanded universe influences on the prequels today. This is by no means exhaustive, just some of my favorites along with some of the most famous ones, so if there's more you'd like to talk about, please drop them in the comments. Thank you for watching. Remember to leave a like and subscribe for more if you've enjoyed the video. And as always, special thanks to the patrons whose names you're seeing on the screen right now for making this kind of video possible.